The jungle on Guadalcanal doesn't sleep. Even in the dead of night, the air hums with insects, heavy with salt and rot, the kind of damp heat that clings to your lungs. For the Marines dug into shallow foxholes along a nameless creek, this night in August 1942 felt like one more test in a campaign that seemed endless. Their uniforms were soaked, their bodies worn down by weeks of hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Yet, in their hands, each man carried a weapon that whispered a different story, one not yet told to their enemy. Across the creek, 917 Japanese soldiers of the Ichiki detachment were gathering in silence. These were not novices, they were veterans of China, of Southeast Asia, men who had known nothing but victory. Their confidence came not only from their discipline and courage, but also from the rifles they carried, the Arisaka Type 99. Sleek, accurate, and reliable, these bolt-action rifles had been the backbone of the Imperial Army for decades. To Japanese soldiers, they were more than steel and wood. They were an extension of the warrior spirit, proof that precision and willpower could overcome any enemy. What the Japanese did not know, what their intelligence officers had failed to detect, was that tonight, for the first time, they would face something different. Something hidden inside the mud-caked hands of the young Marines crouching behind sandbags. The Americans too were afraid. They were outnumbered, cut off, their supplies stretched thin. But fear is not the whole story. Alongside the fear was determination, the stubborn, quiet kind that says, not one step back. And in the darkness, as they checked their ammunition, adjusted their helmets, and whispered to each other about home, they drew strength from the rifles resting across their knees. Rifles that could fire again and again without pause. Rifles that turned a single soldier into the equal of many. No one on either side could have guessed that this small patch of jungle, this narrow sandbar across a creek called Alligator, would become the place where military history shifted. In less than an hour, the sound of battle would echo across the palms, not the measured crack of bolt-action fire, but a rapid, relentless rhythm that would change how every soldier in the Pacific understood combat. This is not just a story about rifles. It's a story about belief, about the danger of underestimating your enemy, and about the way technology can overturn centuries of tradition in a single night. It's the story of how a rifle called the M1 Garand, the greatest battle implement ever devised, as General George Patton would later call it, reshaped the Pacific War. And it begins, as many turning points in history do, with men waiting in the dark, convinced they already knew how the battle would end. 1. Guadalcanal in the darkness. The night over Guadalcanal was not like the nights most of us know. There were no streetlights, no quiet hum of cars in the distance, no comfort of a roof overhead. Instead, there was the jungle dense, wet, and alive. The air itself seemed to press down on the Marines in their foxholes, thick with the smell of salt from the nearby sea and the heavy rot of tropical vegetation. Every breath tasted of the island, as if the land itself was watching them. For the Marines, many barely out of high school, this was their first great test. They had landed only weeks before, sweating under the weight of packs and rifles, and now they found themselves holding a thin line against an enemy they had been told was unstoppable. Hunger gnawed at them, rain soaked them without mercy, yet even in that misery they leaned on each other. A shared cigarette passed between dirty fingers. A quiet joke whispered to break the tension. These small moments of humanity are what kept them steady through the darkness. Across the creek, the Japanese soldiers were also waiting in silence. They too were exhausted, but their weariness was different. They carried the confidence of men who had not lost a battle in years. Veterans of China and Southeast Asia, they believed this night would be no different, another victory written in their history. In their eyes, the Marines were already beaten, just waiting to be swept into the sea. If you picture this scene, you can almost feel the weight of belief pressing down on both sides. The Marines believing they had no choice but to stand, and the Japanese believing they could not lose. The island itself became a stage for two stories of faith colliding head-on. The lesson here is simple, but powerful. Battles are not only fought with weapons, they are fought with what men believe about themselves and about their enemy. Sometimes, those beliefs are the strongest weapon of all, and sometimes, they are the most dangerous weakness. As the hours crept toward dawn, the jungle held its breath. Two forces faced each other in the mist, each certain of their destiny. And yet, Hidden within the hands of the American Marines lay a secret that would soon upend every belief the Japanese carried into this fight. 2. The Arisaka rifle and the myth of bolt-action supremacy. In the hands of Japanese soldiers that night was a weapon they trusted as much as their own heartbeat, the Type 99 Arisaka rifle. 7 pounds of steel and wood, built with precision in Japanese factories, polished until it gleamed a deep blue-black. For years, it had been more than just a tool of war. It was a symbol of the Imperial Army's discipline and superiority. To the Japanese soldier, the Arisaka was proof that victory came from precision, not from sheer volume of fire. With each bolt worked smoothly click, clack, a skilled marksman could put a bullet exactly where it was meant to go. In training, soldiers were drilled until they could fire 15 aimed shots in a single minute, each round carefully placed. They believed this discipline set them apart from their enemies, and in many ways history seemed to prove them right. At Marco Polo Bridge in 1937, Japanese rifle fire had shattered Chinese formations. In the Philippines, defenders armed with Springfield rifles and Enfields fell before waves of Arisaka fire delivered with ruthless efficiency. The weapon had never failed them, and so they assumed it never would. But here is where the danger lies. When we put too much faith in one way of doing things, when a doctrine or a weapon becomes sacred, it blinds us to change. The Japanese believed the world of infantry combat would always belong to the bolt-action rifle, just as it had in World War I. What they could not see was that innovation had already begun to outpace tradition. A simple example: imagine a craftsman who insists on using hand tools because they've never failed him. He works with skill, speed, and pride. But then one day, a neighbor arrives with a power drill. Suddenly, the craftsman's years of experience feel outdated, not because his tools lost quality, but because technology had leapt forward. That was the reality about to confront the Japanese army. The Arisaka Type 99 was not a bad rifle. In fact, it was one of the finest bolt actions of its time. But against what the Americans carried on Guadalcanal, it would prove as outmatched as a samurai sword against an automatic weapon. And so, while the Japanese prepared with confidence in their Arisakas, believing every Marine rifle across the creek was just another Springfield bolt action, they were already walking toward a revelation that would shake their faith to its core. 3. Japanese doctrine: spirit and precision over fire volume. For the Japanese army, rifles were not just pieces of equipment. They were the embodiment of an entire way of fighting, a philosophy rooted in both modern training and ancient tradition. From the very first day of basic training, soldiers were taught that the true strength of a warrior lay in precision and discipline. Every shot fired was expected to be aimed, purposeful, and deadly. This belief came from decades of victories. Japanese troops prided themselves on the ability to fire bolt-action rifles with mechanical speed while maintaining accuracy. A well-trained soldier could chamber a round, fire, and rechamber in less than 2 seconds 15 accurate rounds in a single minute. To officers, this was proof that Japanese doctrine worked. Spirit, discipline, and precision would always triumph over brute force. Think of it as a duel between swordsmen. To the Japanese, the Marine across the creek was not just another soldier. He was an opponent in a contest of skill, where calm, focus, and precise strikes would bring victory. One shot, one kill was more than a phrase, it was the heart of their doctrine. And yet, there was a blind spot in this philosophy. They believed that technology could not change the balance of the duel. They assumed that as long as both sides carried bolt-action rifles, the side with greater discipline and spirit would win. What they didn't realize was that their opponent had quietly rewritten the rules of the contest. Here's the lesson. Discipline and courage are powerful, but when they become rigid, they can trap you. A soldier with perfect aim and iron will may still lose if his weapon belongs to yesterday's war. Belief alone cannot outpace innovation. The Japanese carried this doctrine with unshakable faith into the jungles of Guadalcanal. Their leaders spoke of superior spirit and disciplined fire, as if they were unbreakable shields. And for years those words had been true. But across the creek, the Americans were holding rifles that could deliver not just precision, but speed, a weapon that didn't fit into the Japanese understanding of battle. The stage was set for a collision not only of armies but of philosophies. The old world of bolt-action precision against the new world of semi-automatic firepower. 4. U.S. intelligence underestimation by Japan. One of the quiet killers in war is not bullets or bombs, it is false confidence. And on Guadalcanal, the Japanese carried a dangerous kind of certainty. They believed they knew exactly what the Marines had in their hands. Japanese intelligence had studied American forces for years. Reports described Marines armed with the same bolt-action M1903 Springfield rifles used in World War I. Good rifles, yes, but nothing new, nothing revolutionary. Photographs, captured samples, and even battlefield encounters in the Philippines all seemed to confirm the same story. One shot, then the pause of the bolt, then another shot. To the Japanese, this was familiar ground. They had faced it before, and they had beaten it before. So when Colonel Ichiki gathered his officers before the attack, he spoke with calm certainty. The enemy rifles are no better than ours. Their discipline is weaker, their morale is broken. Victory is assured. These words were not arrogance in his eyes, they were the logical conclusion of what intelligence had told him. But intelligence in war is like looking through a keyhole. You see part of the room, never the whole picture, and sometimes what you don't see is more important than what you do. While Japan assumed the Marines carried only Springfields, American factories had been quietly filling crates with something else entirely. By 1942, tens of thousands of M1 Garand rifles had already reached the Pacific. It's a reminder that in war, the most dangerous assumptions are the ones that feel too obvious to question. The Japanese officers believed their information was solid, their conclusions correct. And yet, that belief would march 917 men into a trap they could not imagine. A simple modern comparison might help. Imagine preparing for a chess game convinced your opponent only knows the rules of checkers. Every move you plan is based on that belief. And then, in the first few minutes, you realize your opponent isn't playing your game at all, they're playing theirs, and you're already losing. That was the reality facing Colonel Ichiki's men, though they didn't know it yet. As the Japanese made final preparations to attack across Alligator Creek, they did so under the shadow of this fatal underestimation. They believed they were stepping into a battle already won, but in truth, they were about to face a weapon and a doctrine that their intelligence had completely missed. 5. Early clues. The strange sounds of American rifles. The jungle has a way of carrying sound. A cough, a whispered word, the snap of a branch, it all drifts through the humid night air, magnified, distorted, stretched. And in the days before the attack, some Japanese soldiers began to notice something odd drifting across the creek from the Marine lines. It wasn't the familiar crack-pause-crack rhythm of bolt-action rifles. They knew that sound well. One shot, then the pause as a soldier lifted the bolt, ejected the casing, and loaded the next round. But what they heard now was different. Short bursts, steady patterns, almost like a drum beat. Pop, 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 pop. Then silence. Then the rhythm again. Veterans like Sergeant Kenji Tanaka felt a twinge of unease. His instincts told him something didn't quite fit. A young private even whispered, "Sergeant, they don't sound like Filipinos. These Americans, they sound different." Tanaka hushed him, reminding him of what the officers had said. The enemy carried Springfields, nothing more. Doubt, in the Japanese army, was not something to be voiced aloud. And yet, that whisper of doubt mattered. It was the battlefield itself trying to warn them, sending signals through the darkness. But when an army is built on certainty, even clear signs can be ignored. Here's the lesson. Sometimes, reality speaks in small clues, a sound, a change, a detail that doesn't fit. If we brush it aside because it doesn't match our expectations, we set ourselves up for shock. In war, as in life, the cost of ignoring small warnings can be devastating. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese soldiers pressed forward, carrying their faith in doctrine and discipline, dismissing the strange rhythms as nerves or tricks of the jungle. They told themselves it couldn't be anything new, but in truth, those sounds were the first whispers of a revolution in infantry combat. And so, when Colonel Ichiki gathered his men under the dim light of a jungle canopy and gave his orders to attack, they marched not just against Marines, but against a reality they had refused to believe. Colonel Ichiki's fatal confidence. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was not a reckless man. At 44, he was considered one of the most capable officers in the Imperial Japanese Army. He had fought in China, had overseen victories across the Pacific, and his name carried the weight of reputation. When he walked among his men on Guadalcanal, they straightened their backs not only because of rank, but because they believed in him. Ichiki himself believed too. He was convinced that the Marines across the creek were isolated, starving, and ready to collapse. He had been told they had no reinforcements, no hope of resupply. In his mind, the battle ahead was not a desperate struggle, it was a clean-up operation, a swift strike to brush aside a broken enemy. With quiet authority, he reminded his company commanders, "The Americans carry bolt-action rifles, just as we do. But they lack our discipline, our training, our spirit. We will break them within minutes." His words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. Confidence radiated from him like heat, and his men absorbed it. The problem wasn't Ichiki's courage or his leadership. It was the information he trusted. His faith in intelligence reports and in decades of Japanese doctrine left no room for doubt. And when leaders cannot doubt, they cannot adapt. It's a mistake we see beyond war as well. Confidence, when unchecked, becomes a cage. It blinds us to the possibility that the world has already changed. Colonel Ichiki was about to discover this truth in the most brutal way possible. Picture him that night. Sword polished, uniform damp with jungle humidity, giving a final nod to his officers. He believed he was leading his men into another chapter of Japanese triumph. Instead, he was leading them into a storm of firepower his doctrine had never imagined. The lesson here is sobering. The greatest danger to any leader is not fear, it is certainty. And certainty was about to carry Ichiki and his 917 soldiers across a sandbar that history would remember not for victory, but for annihilation. 7. The charge at Alligator Creek. In the early hours of the 21st of August 1942, the jungle finally gave up its silence. Colonel Ichiki raised his sword, a blade polished until it caught what little starlight slipped through the clouds and signaled the advance. 917 men surged forward, bayonets fixed, rifles chambered, boots splashing through the shallow waters of Alligator Creek. For the Japanese, this was not chaos but choreography. Their doctrine prized order. Lines moved as one. Rifles came up together. The sound of bolts cycling click, clack, click, clack was a chorus of discipline. To them, this was how an army proved its strength, a mass of warriors charging with unshakable confidence, each man a part of something greater. From the other side, the Marines watched through the mist. Their foxholes were shallow, their bodies worn thin from weeks of combat and hunger. But they had dug in, laid fields of fire, and checked their weapons again and again. In their hands were the tools of a new kind of warfare, the M1 Garand rifles, cleaned and loaded, ready for what was coming. The sandbar itself became the stage. It was narrow, exposed, a strip of earth that gave no cover. Yet the Japanese charged without hesitation, believing their discipline and precision would overwhelm the tired Marines. One survivor would later recall the eerie calm of that moment, the rhythmic splashes of boots, the bayonets glinting, the click of bolts sliding home. It felt unstoppable, like watching a wave roll toward the shore. And here lies the lesson. Bravery without awareness is often the most tragic form of courage. The Ichiki detachment was not foolish. They were trained, disciplined, and extraordinarily brave, but their courage was tied to a belief that the enemy across the creek was weaker, slower, and already beaten. They charged into history carrying certainty, not realizing they were stepping into the teeth of a storm that would rewrite the rules of battle. As the Japanese reached the halfway mark across the sandbar, the first American rifle cracked, then another, then another. But the rhythm was not what the Japanese expected. It was faster, relentless, almost impossible. What should have been single shots separated by the pause of a bolt became a drumbeat of fire. And in that moment, the myth of bolt-action supremacy began to shatter. 8. First clash. When bolt-action meets semi-automatic fire. The first shots snapped through the mist like cracks of thunder. At first, the Japanese thought it was the expected Springfield fire, one shot, a pause, then another. But almost instantly something felt wrong. The rhythm was too fast, too steady. It wasn't the desperate rattle of machine guns either. This was different. Across the sandbar, Marines squeezed their triggers again and again, their M1 Garand rifles answering with a sharp, measured pop 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 pop. No bolts lifted, no pause between shots, just a seamless stream of aimed fire, each round landing with deadly precision. Captain Nishimura raised his Type 99 Arisaka, fired, then yanked his bolt click, clack. In that 2-second motion, he heard 8 American shots cut the night. He fired again, then cursed. The math hit him harder than the gunfire, his 1 bullet against their 8. And it wasn't just him. Every Marine seemed to carry the firepower of 3 or 4 Japanese soldiers. A Marine survivor later recalled how surreal it felt. "We didn't feel outnumbered anymore," he said. "It was like the rifle itself was fighting alongside us. You just kept firing, and it kept answering." For men who had felt starved, cut off, and surrounded for weeks, the Garand was more than a weapon. It was hope that had steel and wood and a voice of its own. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side, disbelief turned quickly to horror. Soldiers who had trained their entire careers on the supremacy of bolt-action rifles found themselves outpaced at every trigger pull. Their discipline, their courage, their carefully timed volleys all dissolved under the simple fact that their rifles belonged to yesterday's war. And here's the lesson. Revolutions in technology are rarely obvious until the moment they appear on the battlefield. The Japanese had faced Springfields in the Philippines, Lee Enfields in Burma, Mosins in China. Every army seemed the same. Why would America be any different? But the difference wasn't in spirit or training, it was in innovation. And innovation doesn't ask permission, it simply changes the game. As the firefight escalated, the sandbar became a killing field. The Japanese still pressed forward with bravery, but bravery could not match a weapon that multiplied American firepower 3-fold. Each ping of an empty Garand clip, followed by the immediate slam of a new one, was another reminder that the old rules of infantry combat were gone. The age of bolt-action supremacy had ended in the span of minutes. 9. The firepower ratio that shattered an army. On paper, the battle should have been hopeless for the Marines. 917 Japanese soldiers against barely 2,000 Americans dug in along the creek. The numbers leaned heavily toward the attackers. That was why Ichiki had been so confident his men had always won when the odds were like this. But on Guadalcanal, numbers lied. The truth of battle was measured not in bodies but in bullets, and how fast those bullets could fly. A Japanese soldier with a Type 99 could fire perhaps 15 aimed rounds per minute, cycling his bolt with practiced precision. A Marine with an M1 Garand could fire 40 to 50 aimed rounds in the same time, without ever breaking his rhythm. Multiply that by every Marine on the line, and suddenly the defenders didn't have the firepower of 2,000 men, they had the firepower of 5,000 or 6,000. It was as if every Marine had brought 3 invisible comrades to the fight, each one firing alongside him. The math was cruel, but undeniable. One Marine later explained it simply, "You didn't think about it in numbers. You just fired." And the rifle kept firing. It felt like we were stronger than we really were. For men exhausted and malnourished, the Garand was a force multiplier, an equalizer that erased Japanese advantages before the battle even began. For the Japanese soldiers charging across the sandbar, the ratio was a nightmare made real. They were used to facing opponents whose rifles sang the same rhythm as theirs. But here, every time they chambered 1 round, the Marines answered with 3. Precision couldn't save them. Spirit couldn't close the gap. The arithmetic of firepower was unforgiving. And this is the lesson. In war, sheer courage cannot overcome the laws of numbers. Technology, when applied at scale, bends the odds so sharply that bravery alone becomes sacrifice. The Ichiki detachment wasn't defeated because they lacked courage. They were defeated because the Americans had quietly changed the math. By the time dawn began to creep over the palms, that math had already written the battle's outcome. What was supposed to be a swift Japanese victory had turned into something unthinkable, a massacre. 10. Human perspective, Japanese shock, and Marine confidence. Numbers tell one story, but faces tell another. On the sandbar at Alligator Creek, you could see the truth written in the expressions of men who had believed in victory only moments before. For Japanese soldiers, the first shock came not from fear, but from confusion. They had trained their ears to recognize the rhythm of battle, 1 shot, a pause, another. But now the night was filled with a relentless pattern of fire they couldn't match. Veterans who had marched from China to the Philippines suddenly felt like recruits facing something they didn't understand. Captain Nishimura is said to have shouted in disbelief, "Impossible," as 8 American shots rang out for every one of his own. On the other side, the Marines felt something they hadn't felt in weeks: control. For days they had lived on half rations, stalked by Japanese patrols, waiting for an attack they weren't sure they could withstand. But when the Garands began to speak, the battlefield shifted. One Marine remembered thinking, "We weren't the ones on defense anymore. We were pushing them back without moving an inch." It was more than firepower, it was psychology. The Japanese had carried the aura of invincibility into the Pacific. To many Americans, they seemed unstoppable, superhuman in their discipline and courage. But that night, as Marines watched enemy soldiers fall one after another, that myth cracked wide open. Suddenly, the Japanese were not untouchable, they were human and vulnerable. Here lies a timeless lesson. In war, the first victory is often in the mind. When one side loses its belief in itself and the other side gains confidence, the outcome is already tilting. The Garand didn't just change the rate of fire, it changed how every man on that battlefield saw himself and his enemy. By the time the first rays of dawn reached the creek, the contrast was stark. The Japanese were stunned, their attack unraveling before their eyes. The Marines, though tired and hungry, now carried themselves differently. They were no longer the defenders of a fragile line, they were the owners of the battlefield. 11. The collapse of the Ichiki detachment. The battle that Colonel Ichiki expected to last minutes stretched into hours of chaos. What had begun as an orderly charge across the sandbar quickly dissolved into a nightmare. Japanese soldiers fell in clusters, their precise formations broken by the relentless rhythm of American semi-automatic fire. Men who had trained their entire lives to cycle bolts with flawless precision found themselves firing too slowly, too deliberately, while Marines poured out streams of fire without pause. The sandbar, lit by muzzle flashes, became a killing ground. One survivor later described it as running into a wall of bullets. Colonel Ichiki had thrown his full weight into the attack. There were no reserves left to regroup, no fallback plan. His entire detachment was committed to that exposed strip of land, and the Garand rifles cut through them like a scythe through tall grass. Tanks and machine guns joined the fight, hammering positions already shredded by rifle fire. By dawn, the result was undeniable. Out of 917 men, only 15 staggered back to tell the tale. Bodies littered the sandbar and the jungle edge. The Ichiki detachment, once a proud unit with a decorated leader, had ceased to exist. For the Japanese army, this was more than a tactical defeat. It was a shock to their identity. The same spirit and discipline that had brought them victory across Asia had now led them into destruction. The soldiers who survived carried with them not only wounds but the unbearable weight of realization. Their rifles, their doctrine, even their leader's certainty had been shattered overnight. And here lies the lesson. Confidence without adaptability leads to ruin. The Ichiki detachment was not defeated because its soldiers lacked bravery. They were defeated because their commanders marched them into a fight with assumptions that no longer matched reality. As the Marines stood among the wreckage of the battle, exhausted but alive, they began to understand the larger truth. Guadalcanal was not just another island. It was the place where the myth of Japanese invincibility broke and where American confidence began to grow roots. 12. Lessons in military innovation. The collapse of the Ichiki detachment was not just the story of one battle lost, it was the story of how innovation can overturn decades of doctrine in a single night. For years, the Japanese army had trusted the supremacy of bolt-action rifles. The logic seemed unshakable. Precision plus discipline equals victory. And for a time, that formula worked. It had carried them through China, through Southeast Asia, through the Philippines. But on Guadalcanal, the formula no longer applied because the Americans had quietly introduced a new variable. The M1 Garand was more than a rifle. It was a revolution packaged in wood and steel. With its semi-automatic action, it allowed an ordinary Marine to fire as fast as his finger could squeeze the trigger. Accuracy was still there, but speed multiplied it. Suddenly, firepower wasn't about how disciplined you were with a bolt, it was about how many aimed rounds you could deliver before the other man had a chance to respond. Think of it like a race. If one runner can only take one step every 2 seconds, while another can take 3 in the same time, the outcome isn't really a race at all. It's a foregone conclusion. That was the brutal reality the Japanese faced at Alligator Creek. The lesson is timeless. In war, technology doesn't just add to the fight, it reshapes the fight. Courage, spirit, and training are vital, but they cannot bend the laws of mechanics. The nation that adapts faster, that equips its soldiers with the tools of tomorrow, holds the advantage no amount of bravery can erase. And this is not just a story of 1942. We see the same pattern in history again and again. The English longbow at Agincourt, the machine gun in World War I, the tank in blitzkrieg warfare. Each time, armies clinging to the old ways were crushed by those who dared to change. On Guadalcanal, the Garand was America's leap forward, the weapon that turned desperate Marines into equals and then into victors. For the Japanese, it was the moment they realized their faith in tradition had left them behind. 13. The industrial miracle behind the Garand. If the M1 Garand was the rifle that changed the battle, American industry was the engine that made it possible. A weapon, after all, is only as powerful as the number of hands it can reach. In Springfield, Massachusetts, and at factories across the United States, assembly lines roared day and night. Skilled workers and ordinary citizens, men too old for the front, women who had never before set foot in a factory, stood shoulder to shoulder producing rifles by the thousands. Precision machinery cut steel to fractions of a millimeter. Inspectors checked every part, from the barrel to the trigger group, to ensure that each Garand would fire reliably in mud, sand, or salt spray. By the end of the war, more than 5 million Garands had been built. Every Marine, every Army infantryman carried the same advantage into battle. This was something no other nation achieved. The Soviets had experimented with the SVT-40, the Germans with the G-41 and later the G-43, but none could produce them at scale. The Japanese tried to copy the Garand with their Type 4 rifle, but managed fewer than 100 before surrender. It was not just engineering, it was organization, resources, and sheer determination. America's industrial base became its secret weapon, ensuring that innovation wasn't just an experiment, but a reality on every battlefield. One Marine later reflected on it this way: "We weren't the best fed, we weren't the most experienced, but when you handed every man a Garand, you gave us something no enemy could take away, the confidence that we could stand our ground." And here lies the lesson: technology alone doesn't change wars. The ability to mass produce, to equip every soldier equally, is what turns an invention into a revolution. Without the factories back home, the Garand would have been just another promising design. With them, it became the backbone of an army. As we step back onto the battlefield of Guadalcanal, this truth becomes clear. The Marines weren't simply holding rifles. They were holding the weight of American industry in their hands. 14. Comparative weapons across nations. To understand just how revolutionary the Garand was, it helps to compare it with what other soldiers carried into battle. Across the world, armies marched with rifles that looked similar: wooden stocks, steel barrels, iron sights, but their performance told a different story. Take the German Karabiner 98K, for example. It was beautifully built, strong and accurate, descended from the famous Mauser line. In the hands of a skilled marksman, it could hit targets at long distances with deadly precision. But it was still a bolt-action rifle. One shot, work the bolt. One shot, work the bolt. Its accuracy was unquestioned, but in close combat, the pause between rounds was costly. The British Lee Enfield had a reputation for speed. Trained riflemen could work its smooth bolt so quickly that a line of Enfields could sound like a machine gun. At Mons in World War I, German soldiers thought they faced automatic weapons when it was really British rifle fire. But even the Lee Enfield, fast as it was, couldn't match the effortless rhythm of the Garand. The Enfield still required skill, still required constant practice. The Garand required only a trigger finger. The Soviets fielded the Mosin Nagant as their standard rifle, a rugged, reliable bolt action. But they also experimented with semi-automatics like the SVT-40. Some Soviet units carried them, but production was limited, and reliability issues meant the rifle never replaced the Mosin. And then there was Japan. The Type 99 Arisaka was strong, durable, and accurate, but by 1942, it was already behind the times. Japanese engineers tried to copy the Garand with their Type 4, but by the time prototypes appeared, the war was nearly over. Here's the lesson. America was the only nation in World War II to equip its frontline infantry universally with semi-automatic rifles. While others dabbled or tested, the United States committed. That decision gave every Marine and every soldier not just parity but superiority in the firefight. And so, on the sandbars of Guadalcanal, on the beaches of Normandy, in the forests of the Ardennes, and in the villages of Italy, the story repeated itself. The Garand gave Americans the ability to fight faster, harder, and with confidence that multiplied across every squad and every platoon. 15. Tactical revolution. Suppression and maneuver. A rifle does more than fire bullets. It shapes how soldiers move, how squads fight, and how battles unfold. The M1 Garand didn't just give American infantry more firepower, it changed their very way of fighting. In most armies of the time, infantry doctrine was built around the limitations of the bolt-action rifle. Soldiers fired carefully aimed shots while machine guns provided the real suppressive fire to pin down the enemy. Moving forward under fire was slow and dangerous because ordinary riflemen couldn't sustain the volume needed to keep enemy heads down. But with the Garand, that equation flipped. Suddenly, every soldier in a squad could put out rapid, accurate fire on his own. A Marine fire team advancing through the jungle could lay down suppressive fire without waiting for a machine gun crew to set up. A squad could move, cover, and attack with a flexibility that most armies of the time couldn't match. There's a telling story from the later battles in Europe. German soldiers, used to fighting opponents with bolt actions, were shocked when American squads poured fire at them from every direction. One German veteran remarked, "Every man seemed to have a machine gun." That was the impression the Garand created a wall of bullets from ordinary riflemen. The tactical revolution went beyond raw firepower. It gave American troops confidence in small unit combat. They could attack positions, hold ground, and outlast enemies because their rifles allowed them to control the tempo of a fight. In modern terms, the Garand gave Americans the ability to fight not just harder, but smarter. The lesson is clear. When technology changes the tool, it changes the tactic. The Garand turned squads into more independent, more dangerous units. And that independence spread across thousands of men reshaped how the US military fought the rest of the war. On Guadalcanal, this meant Marines didn't just hold their line, they pushed back. By dawn, American infantry had gone from exhausted defenders to confident attackers, sweeping across the battlefield with rifles that never seemed to pause. 16. Psychological warfare, the sound of defeat. On every battlefield, sound carries power. The roar of artillery, the whistle of bombs, even silence can change the heart of a soldier. But on Guadalcanal, it was the sound of the M1 Garand that broke Japanese confidence. The rhythm was unlike anything they had faced before, steady, relentless, almost mechanical in its precision. Pop, 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 no pause for a bolt to be worked, no break in the tempo. To Japanese ears trained to expect the measured pace of bolt-action fire, it was as if the Marines were armed with entire squads of machine guns. And then there was the famous ping. Each time a Marine emptied his 8-round clip, the rifle sang out a sharp metallic note as the clip ejected. To American soldiers, that sound became iconic, a signal that their rifle was ready for a fresh reload. But to Japanese soldiers, who didn't understand the weapon's mechanics, it was baffling, even terrifying. A pause? A machine-like chime? And then, almost instantly, the fire resumed without missing a beat. Survivors of the Ichiki detachment later spoke of the shock. One remembered thinking, it was not human. Their rifles fired like machines, but they were aimed like marksmen. It was the psychological blow as much as the bullets that shattered their will. Here's the lesson. War is fought in the mind as much as on the ground. Weapons don't just kill, they intimidate, confuse, and demoralize. The Garand was not just faster, it sounded faster, and that sound echoed in the hearts of enemies who had believed themselves invincible. By dawn, the noise of battle faded into silence, but for those who survived, the memory of that relentless rhythm, the unbroken stream of fire, the strange metallic notes stayed with them. It became the sound of defeat, the moment they realized the old rules of rifle combat no longer applied. 17. Broader Guadalcanal context. It would be easy to think of Guadalcanal as simply the story of one rifle against another, but the truth was larger. The battle for this island was a struggle of endurance, logistics, and willpower. The Garand was one thread in a much bigger tapestry. The Marines who fought along Alligator Creek were not alone. Behind them, the vital airfield at Henderson Field was defended with equal determination. Control of that strip of land meant control of the skies. Japanese bombers attacked almost daily, and US pilots flying worn-out Wildcats and dauntless dive bombers rose to meet them. Above the jungle canopy, another kind of battle was being fought, one of supply lines and attrition. At sea, the story was just as desperate. The waters around Guadalcanal would earn a new name, Iron Bottom Sound, because of the sheer number of ships that sank there. American destroyers, cruisers, and carriers clashed with Japanese naval forces in brutal night battles, often at point-blank range. Supplies arrived piecemeal, sometimes under fire, sometimes not at all. Every sack of rice, every crate of ammunition mattered, and yet, even in this wider context, the Garand mattered deeply. When Marines held their line on the ground, it allowed planes to keep flying from Henderson. When Henderson stayed open, the Navy could hold its precarious position offshore. Piece by piece, the defense of Guadalcanal held because every part reinforced the other. A single Marine with a Garand may not have won the campaign, but thousands of Marines with Garands made sure the Japanese could not break through. The rifle was both symbol and tool, proof that America's industrial might could reach even the far corners of the Pacific. Here's the lesson. Battles are never won by one factor alone. They are won when courage, strategy, technology, and logistics align. The Garand was powerful, but its true strength was how it worked in harmony with air power, naval support, and the stubborn will of tired young men who refused to yield. By the end of 1942, Guadalcanal had become more than an island. It was a turning point, the first major offensive victory for the Allies in the Pacific. And at its heart was a weapon that had turned the tide of one night's battle and symbolized a larger shift in the war. 18. Legacy of the M1 Garand and modern lessons. When the smoke cleared from Guadalcanal, the M1 Garand was no longer just a new rifle, it was a legend. For the Marines who carried it, the Garand became a trusted companion, a weapon that answered every time they pulled the trigger, even in mud, rain, or salt air. For their Japanese opponents, it was a nightmare. A rifle that seemed to fire like a machine gun, yet remained as accurate as a marksman's tool. General George S. Patton would later call it the greatest battle implement ever devised. His words weren't hyperbole. The Garand gave American infantry a decisive edge, not just at Guadalcanal, but at Tarawa, Normandy, the Ardennes, and Okinawa. Wherever it appeared, it shifted the balance of firepower. But its legacy is larger than one war. The Garand reminds us that innovation doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when design meets industry, when vision meets mass production. John Garand's gas-operated rifle might have remained an experiment if not for the factories that built millions, and the soldiers who carried them to every corner of the globe. There's a lesson here that reaches beyond history. The side that embraces change, that adapts faster than its enemy, is the side that shapes the future. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese clung to their faith in the bolt-action rifle, while the Americans quietly rewrote the rules of combat. The result was not just one battle won, but a shift in momentum that helped decide the course of the Pacific War. And today, in a world of drones, artificial intelligence, and hypersonic weapons, the story still matters. Just as the Garand once turned the tide, so too can the tools of tomorrow transform the battlefield in ways we cannot yet imagine. For Captain Nishimura and the survivors of the Ichiki detachment, the sound of the Garand's rapid fire would haunt them as the sound of defeat. For the Marines who held the line that night, it was the sound of hope, of survival, of turning the impossible into the possible. And for us, looking back across the years, it is the sound of a lesson still echoing. In war, as in life, the greatest danger is believing the rules will never change.